trying something a little bit different today. So today I'm going to be trying to use my polymer clay that I bought from the charity shop to make a little miniature roast chicken and also a little miniature roast pheasant for my banqueting table. Well, actually the roast chicken's going to be for my mum, but the roast pheasant will be for my banqueting table. So I started off by taking some of my polymer clay off, but it was really dry and crumbly. Obviously this polymer clay was second hand. I didn't know how long it had been out of its packet, but I had been watching some tutorials online which said that you could condition polymer clay using Vaseline to make it go softer. So I rubbed a little bit of Vaseline on my fingers and it worked really well. Within seconds it started to turn the clay into a much different texture that was much easier to work with. Sorry once again if you can hear my cat purring. I don't know if you can or not, but she has sat herself right next to the microphone again. So I wet the Vaseline into the polymer clay until it was a nice soft texture. This did say that it was soft polymer clay, but I think maybe just because of the age of it, it had gone quite hard and crumbly. So I worked the Vaseline in until I could stretch the clay. As you can see, this is white polymer clay, so I will show you how I changed its colour in a minute. So I sectioned a piece off to about the size that I needed to make my little roast pheasant first. So that's the blob that I've got there. It was about the size of the 10p piece. And then I started to add the colour. So I'd watched some tutorials which said that you could use soft pastels to change the colour of white polymer clay. And I've also seen some that said you could add acrylic paint, although I am aware that the water content of the acrylic paint can make the polymer clay bubble in the oven. So I decided to use the chalk pastels. I gently scraped away to make a chalky powder, and I used the yellows and browns from my pastel palette. And I didn't know how much to work in, with this being my very first attempt at using polymer clay, so I just did it a little bit at a time. As it happens, and as you will see, I actually needed loads of this chalky pastel to change the colour of the clay. Because it's already got the white pigment in the clay, I think that's why the colour doesn't change very drastically. You can get translucent clay, which I think is easier to colour because it hasn't already got those white pigments in. Due to the fact that the colour of the clay wasn't changing that much, I decided to add some of the darker pastel. This pastel is like a terracotta-y colour. It's a mixture between an orangey brown and I thought it had quite a pinkish hue as well. So I combined both of the colours. It was very much an experiment with it being my first go. I kept working the colour into the clay until there had been enough of a colour change. If you compare the colour of the piece of clay in the palette here to the clay in the background, you can see how much it's changed, so it's quite a subtle change, but it started to take on the colour that I wanted. So I'm making a miniature roast pheasant here to go on the banqueting table of my Tudor doll's house, and I'll also be doing some research to see what other foods need to go onto that banqueting table too. I'm thinking miniature pies and bread and maybe some fish. Now you can see that I'm adding some corn flour here because the clay was becoming a little bit sticky and hard to work with. By adding this tiny bit of corn flour to the outside of this piece of clay, it made it so much easier to work with. So I had made this little sort of sausage shape for the main bit of the pheasant, and then I've also got some pieces in the background for the legs. And these lino cutting tools are something that I've bought especially to work with clay. So obviously they're meant to be for cutting lino, but I found them in a shop in Manchester and I thought that they looked ideal for my clay. So I'll give them a go. So I started by cutting out a little V shape from the end of this main piece of clay, and for this I used the lino tool that has a semicircle end, which worked perfectly. So considering it's not a tool for using for clay, actually I'd really recommend it. So it's a lino cutting tool. And I then used this little tool which I got from the charity shop to just smooth out that end a little bit. As my hands heated up the clay, it did become a little stickier again, so I did keep adding a little bit more corn flour. My next stage was to add a hole to this end of the clay. And to do this, I just pushed into the clay using the tool with the little sort of tiny little sphere at the end of it, the one that I just used a second ago for smoothing off the V shape. I then took a tiny piece of clay and flattened it down, and I'm going to use this bit just to cover around the entrance to the hole that I made so that it's not so neat. I smoothed down the edges where the joins were to try and hide them. This was my first time working with polymer clay, and actually I found that it was a material that was really easy to use and it was really easy to handle, especially after I'd added that corn flour. I then moved on to the legs, so the clay that I had initially sectioned off was a little bit too much, so I decided to reduce it slightly. I looked at some pictures on the internet to look at the shape, to try and decide how much clay I needed and what sort of shape I needed to mould it into. I found the wings really tricky to do because as I rolled the small amount of clay between my fingers, it heated it up, which made it go more sticky, so I had to keep using corn flour for this bit. And I also found that making them go to the correct sort of pointy shape was quite difficult because they kept being quite round when I wanted them to have quite an acute sort of angle to them. Next, it was time to work on the shape of the back legs. I decided that I had too much clay here, so I halved it and then I started to roll it out into the correct shape. I'm working on a glass dish here, which I found worked really well because the clay didn't stick to it. There is a little bit of residue from the Vaseline that you can see there, and there's also a bit of residue from the corn flour that I added, but it didn't affect how I was working with my clay. If anything, it helped. Again, I had to think carefully about the size and shape and direction of this part because I did nearly put it on back to front. So it's not the correct shape here. I was just having a think at this point about the size and where it was going to go. took me quite a few attempts to roll the correct shape. It was very delicate, and because it was such a small amount of clay, it was heating up quite quickly, making it go softer and stickier. But I was quite happy with this shape that you can see here, and I just stretched out the tips a little bit further with this tool. I smoothed some of the edges down onto the main part of the clay. As I was working with the clay, I added a little bit more corn flour, as you can see here, because it was starting to get a little bit tacky and stick to my fingers, and I could see my fingerprints on it. I then used some of my other tools to make some texture in the piece of clay, and I did some marks where the legs joined, and I also did some marks along the top. I then made two little holes here. Sorry about the video going out of focus here, but I made two little holes so that I could put some white polymer clay into the ends of the legs. It's not the best camera angle here, sorry, but I'm just pulling the little pink bits of the clay up and over the edges of the white. I hadn't realised that I'd moved my little pheasant right down to the bottom of the camera shot there, so sorry about that you can only see the ends of it. I then used this tool that I'd found in the charity shop to add some texture. I then made a difficult decision. I was happy with how it was looking, but I've decided to take one of the legs away so that that can sit on one of the plates. So rather than having it as a whole piece, I am separating it so that one bit is on the serving dish in the middle of the table and one bit is going to be on a plate. I deliberately left the bottom bit with a rough edge so that it wasn't a clean cut, and I did this by pulling the clay away at the bottom rather than slicing through it. I scored some marks into the clay here to add a little bit of texture, and then it was time for it to go into the oven. As you can see, I baked it at the same time with some other pieces that I've made. I'll put them into separate videos because this one's getting a little bit long. Once the clay was baked and cooled, it was time to start painting it. So I used some liquid watercolour paints. So I've just put the packaging there. It's from a shop called Sostrine Green, I think it's called. It's in Manchester and there is a website as well. It's the same shop that I bought my lino cutting tools from. Now, I've never seen liquid watercolour paints like these. They were like inks, and I actually bought them because I absolutely loved the packaging, which isn't the reason to buy paint. That was a silly reason, but the colours were beautiful, so I am glad I've bought them. This set of paints came with these 5 colours, and I also bought another set that came with the blues and the greens. Now, I haven't ever seen that watercolour paint works on polymer clay, but I wanted to give it a try. I thought I had nothing to lose. So I wanted a translucent sort of effect because obviously my clay had already been coloured with the pastels, but it wasn't looking like a cooked chicken or cooked pheasant, a roasted one. So I started by painting it with the yellow colour, which you can see here, and I then added this orangey brown colour because I wanted it to go darker. I found that the colours seemed to dry quite quickly, but I'm not sure if the clay absorbed them, but the colours weren't quite as vibrant once they had dried, so I layered them up in stages as they dried. A little word of advice is do not hold your polymer clay by the thinnest piece of clay because it will snap off like this little leg just did. But never mind, it hasn't affected it too much. I deliberately didn't paint where the leg had been cut away because I felt like the colour was already correct for the inside part there. I did, however, do the outside of the leg here, but again, the bit where it had been cut away I left as its original colour. I did use a little bit of tissue just to mop away a little bit of the paint that had just pooled in the inside of the clay here. Whilst I was happy with the colours, as the paint dried I felt like it lacked a little bit of depth of colour, so I scraped away at some of the pastels again and I just daubed on some of the chalky pastel over the top of the wet paint whilst it was still drying. I was really pleased with how the colours had layered up by using the combination of watercolour paints and the pastels. You can see here I added a little bit of water to these pastels as well. Now I needed to seal all of this in, so I decided to use some gloss varnish. However, this gloss varnish was actually found in the charity shop, the same one where I found the clay. My mum found it and bought it for me. But unfortunately, when it came to try and use it, it was completely dried out. So I've had to pause here and order some online because I can't find any shop where I live that sells it. So I will come back and show you next after it has arrived. Seeing as I was doing an online order, I decided to buy a few extra bits, so I'm going to show you them. So this was the gloss varnish that I bought. I decided to get Polymer because it was the same maker as the clay that I'd been using, but I also got some liquid Sculpey, which is like a liquid clay. I've never used it before, but it's something that I want to try. And as well as that, I also bought this Polymer Effect clay, which is black and it's got sort of a glittery metallic-y effect to it because I want to try and make a little pan. And I also bought this translucent clay, which is Sculpey make rather than the Polymer, so we'll see how it goes. So this is my first time varnishing any clay products, so I'm just going to paint it on really thinly and then leave it to dry, and if it's not glossy enough I can then layer it up. I used 2 layers of gloss, although the second layer I only put in certain areas to add more of a sheen, and then I decided that I needed a little wooden serving tray to put this on. So I simply made it out of plywood, I rounded off the edges with some sandpaper, scored into it with a craft knife to make it look used, and just went over it with a wash of raw umber acrylic paint. I'm sorry I didn't get the footage for that bit, but it was really quick to make and it was just made out of a tiny little scrap that I had left over. You may have noticed that I just used some Yoo-hoo glue to stick on that little piece of clay that fell off earlier in the video. Please let me know what you think of my first clay creation. I have also made some pumpkins and some apples, so let me know in the comments if you want to see how to make them. And thank you for watching. Please do hit subscribe if you haven't already. I'm hoping to upload a video every Wednesday. Bye!